Media Network proudly presents a weekly exploration of various spiritual practices with renowned spiritual authors, coaches, teachers, and Dr. Tracy Brown, RScP.
And now, here's Tracy.
Hey everybody, welcome to Poetry, Prayer, and Practice. My name is Tracy Brown, and I love hosting this show for so many reasons, at least 3 reasons. One, I get to talk about and reflect on poetry and the impact that it has on my spiritual life and on the spiritual lives of others. Prayer, maybe my favorite spiritual practice, maybe. I get to really remind myself that prayer is such an important part of my spiritual life and my life. And then third, practices. I really have enjoyed doing this show because I get to talk about all different kinds of spiritual practices. My guests bring examples of spiritual practices I've never thought about, and it reminds me each week that there is such a broad range of spiritual practices that we can use in order to manifest what we desire, to live a life we love. And every week on Tuesdays at noon Mountain Time, I hope you, like me, enjoy having the opportunity to take a breath and be reminded. So under spiritual practices throughout the year, the reason that got into the title of Poetry, Prayer, Practice is because what I realized was that when we say, or when I would say spiritual practice to coaching clients, or if I were giving a talk and I mentioned spiritual practices, that people pretty much only talked about a couple of things. Their interpretation or definition of the term spiritual practice was, well, I meditate every morning, that I'm supposed to do that, right? Or I make a gratitude list every day. That's a spiritual practice. And I pray, or I ask someone to pray for me. So beyond meditation, affirmations, using affirmations, writing a gratitude list, and prayer, people rarely mentioned anything else. And I found that fascinating because I realized that there are so many different ways to use spiritual practice, to develop spiritual practice, to integrate spiritual practice into your life. So that's why the third P is practices, because we get the opportunity to talk about maybe some practices that we don't think about as spiritual practices. And I'm explaining that especially today because today's conversation is all about a spiritual practice that, or a set of spiritual practices that many people don't think of as spiritual practice. And to help me do that, I invited Rev Jeffrey Ryan to join me in a conversation because it just felt like a topic I wanted to explore more. And I knew that he and I could have a great conversation about this. So the spiritual practice we're going to be talking about today is the spiritual practice of inclusion, or how is inclusion a spiritual practice? So while you're beginning to think about that and your answer for that question, I'm going to bring Reverend Jeffrey on. But you know, I always say 3 random things about my guests, of the many, many things I know about, most of them. And Jeffrey is no exception, that I could tell you 40 things I know about him, probably, or more. So the random 3, this they are Jeffrey Ryan is a minister, a CSL licensed ordained minister. Number two, Jeffrey Ryan speaks at least 3 languages fluently. And number three, Jeffrey Ryan is my go-to person. If I have a question about visioning, or if I want someone else to walk me through, like facilitate my visioning process, because he is, he's just my go-to person. I love the way that he visions. I know it's important to him, and I trust him to do visioning or to know the answer to any question anybody ever asks me about visioning. So, so welcome, Jeff Ryan.
Hi, Tracy. All right.
So is there anything else you want people to know about you as before we dive into this conversation? And maybe it's a question. Is inclusion a spiritual practice?
Oh, absolutely. Inclusion is a spiritual practice. Without a doubt, inclusion is a spiritual practice.
So what else do we need to know about you?
Yeah. What else do we need to know about me? Today I have, well, not just today, but I have 2 dogs, Oliver and Paisley. And they live with Eddie and I. And sometimes they supervise when we are here at home. All during the pandemic, we called them our supervisors. They would sit behind us on the sofa or the bed, wherever we were, and they would sit behind us and make sure that we were staying on task. So, but they are wonderful, loving taskmasters. So sometimes they require some attention, but
Oliver and Bailey.
Paisley.
Yeah, it's like Bailey. That doesn't sound right. Paisley,
like Paisley Park. Yeah, Paisley.
Oh, because I'm imagining. Why would you name a dog Paisley unless it like had designs or something? And then my brain went to, I wonder if it's a long-haired dog, and when they take Paisley to get groomed, if they do a Paisley design all right. So I'm just admitting my brain is a little out of control today.
That's quite all right. She's a Chiweenie. She's part Chihuahua, part Dachshund, and so she's got a longer body, and the feet are like dachshund feet, and they're short, and then she's got a little Chihuahua face, so she's super cute.
Oh, that sounds so cute.
Yeah. But she's in with Ed right now so that you and I can have this conversation and not be disturbed.
Well, a few weeks ago, I was in a conversation with someone, and we were actually talking about something that is in my book, Stained Glass Spirit, Becoming a Spiritual Community Where Oneness Does Not Require Sameness. And I don't even remember exactly what we were talking about, because what stuck with me was my response to something she said was, well, being inclusive is just applying our spiritual principles, and really it's a spiritual practice. And her response was like, what? like what do you mean it's a spiritual practice? It's just something we do. And then we went into this, whole conversation about humanity and human priorities versus spirituality or divinity, and spiritual or divinity priorities. And I've been thinking about that off and on ever since.
Okay.
So I don't even actually have the answer, right? Because I do diversity work. There's often not the answer. There are many answers or possibilities. But for me, let's start with this. For me, inclusion is a spiritual practice because I am engaging with someone else or with other people, asking myself, how can I, in this conversation or interaction, represent one of three qualities of God: love,
Mhm.
harmony,
Mm-hmm.
or unity.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that is, it's driving my exchange or my interaction with them, because I am trying to represent the love of God, or the reality of unity as a spiritual principle,
Mm-hmm.
unity versus separation, right? Or or harmony, that we are very, very different. Like, a key at each end of the keyboard of a piano keyboard, they're very, very different.
Right.
But when engaged appropriately, they make great harmony. They work together.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the time I am striving for, not let's all get along and pretend we like each other, but a true harmony of combining, using the ways we're different to create something together, whether that's a relationship, a report, a project, a community, or a church.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's a little hard to separate it out, but that's kind of my summary. Here's why I think inclusion, and being inclusive, is a spiritual practice.
Right. I totally agree. I mean, it's the harmony, the resonance. Like when we approach things, if we're all different, right? Diversity and inclusion are natural in spirit. Because if we believe that if we believe that God is all there is, if there's only one, if there's just this one unity, one life, what have you, then the beauty of spirit is manifest in the diversity of spirit and the diversity of life and the diversity of creation. So it's natural. It's absolutely, that is part of spirit. That's part of creation. And then we recognize that if spirit is everything, God is all there is, the divine is all there is, then everything is already included in that. There is nothing separate from that. So therefore, inclusion also has to be included in the all in all, right? It has to be included. Inclusion has to be included. It's natural. It's the thing, right? And so when we get to then see when the diversity is then included, like you've said before, it's not like your book, it's not about being sameness. That oneness doesn't mean sameness. Or as Ernest Holmes said, unity is not uniformity, right? We have this opportunity to come together and learn from one another and experience one another and experience ourselves in whole new ways. As Valerie Kaur says in her See No Stranger memoir, she says, "You are a part of me I do not know yet."
Yeah, right.
I do not know yet. So it's just such an opportunity to then get to know myself through you, through our collaboration, through our harmony, through our resonance. I get to know me. I get to know spirit in a whole nother way that I have not yet had access to spirit. That's what I love about learning other languages. I develop this capability of expressing myself and understanding myself in a whole different context, because there are certain words in Japanese that just don't translate into English. There are certain phrases that are used in Spanish that are so much more beautiful and so much more poetic than in English. And so envisioning in another language like opens up spirit to me in a whole new way. So having access to all of that and being inclusive and feeling the inclusion and all that is just so much richer, even from a personal experience. And then when we get to have the conversations with one another, right? And we are looking at each other through, as you said, love, harmony, unity, then it just expands what's possible for our relationship and then for the larger relationship, for the community and for the world as a whole. It's beautiful. I absolutely love it. Absolutely. It's a spiritual practice for sure, for sure.
So as you're talking, I thought about inclusion and
Inclusion and harmony. Mm-hmm.
and so obviously, you know, we're having this conversation in real time, and so inclusion feels to me like a human activity,
Mm-hmm.
and harmony is the absolute state that exists because everything has been created by the same source that has created it all, and it's all in harmony.
Mm-hmm.
Different by design, but in harmony. But until you said what you said, that was challenging where I realized, oh, I really think of inclusion as a human activity, but the way you described it, it shifted for me that no, inclusion is the absolute nature of life because it is. It is all one, it is all included. But the activity of being inclusive is human.
Yes. I would agree with that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so my spiritual practice is about being and what I do to either generate, sustain, or arrive at the natural state of inclusion and harmony that spirit has already created.
Right. So it's also in that inclusion and in that harmony, there's also that sense of wholeness, right? Which is another
Yes,
absolute
wholeness.
quality, you know, is wholeness. And we as spiritual beings having spiritual experiences as in human form, the way I say that. we are not spiritual beings having human experiences. We are spiritual beings having spiritual experiences in human form. We often will disown qualities about ourselves that we don't like, that we can't really accept as being true for ourselves. So, you know, we disown these, and so we are creating separation by disowning. It's like, oh, you know, when you see somebody and you're like, he's a jerk. Well, guess what? If you spot it, you got it, right? And so that is, you know, an example of a disowned quality. It's something that you're seeing in somebody else that you're triggered by. And that's right there is an opportunity to do the work of inclusion by bringing it back into yourself, by reclaiming it, reframing it, and having a relationship with it of, all right, so I'm calling him a jerk. So where am I a jerk? How can I show up as a jerk? And frequently we get trapped in the thinking that if we call somebody a jerk, it's like, yeah, but I'm not a jerk because I don't do that. Right. But your jerkiness might show up differently than somebody else's jerkiness, right? But it's still there, it's still present. And so if somebody were to call you a name, right, or call you some quality or say, oh, Jeff is so lazy, I might get triggered by that if I haven't reincorporated it, if I haven't re-owned it and go, you know what? Yeah, sometimes I am lazy and sometimes I can be a jerk. And here's how those two qualities, because the qualities themselves are neutral, here's how those two qualities can support me in getting what I want or experiencing, you know, something different. Like, okay, so I'm lazy. Well, flipping that is like, all right, that gives me the opportunity for self-care. That gives me the opportunity to rest rather than go, go, go. Or being a jerk, well, sometimes I feel I have to be assertive in certain situations if something is going to be accomplished. Can I do it with more compassion? Absolutely. And there are certain times where you have, where I might have to employ being a jerk.
Well, and I love that particular example because when, I may say, oh, this person's being a jerk. But if I do ask that question, when might I be, or when do I show up as a jerk? Then if I can go, other people then would label me that way.
Mm-hmm.
But because I am facilitating this group and I'm responsible for leading the group to a certain outcome, and I have a reason for speaking that way or treating someone in a way that they would label me a jerk, then that does shift me in that moment to this person I just called the jerk. Not that they are the leader at that point, but there is some reason that they are behaving the way they are behaving that makes sense to them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what that is. I am not privy to it. Depending on who it is, I may or may not have a conversation with them about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I can I can deactivate
Right.
my human desire to create a barrier or a boundary that I will now use as an excuse
Mm-hmm.
to ignore, disrespect, or somehow, create some next step.
Right. Well, and that's where we get into separating the action from the actor, or separating the behaviors from the people, right? Is that, yes, was it unskilled behavior? Absolutely. Is it wrong in our context? Yes, absolutely. The behavior was unskilled, it was uncalled for, what have you. And instead of labeling that person with the unskilled behavior and associating the person, the key I find to inclusion and also to remember that, okay, everything is spirit, everybody is one, we're all divine, we're all manifestations, impartations, emanations of the one life. Sometimes that's easier to see than others. But by separating the action or the unskilled behavior from the person, then I have a greater capacity to return back to that place of love, harmony, or unity in the moment, to have compassion in that moment, so that I'm not taking that on. I'm not internalizing the anger, the frustration, the trigger as well, that I'm able to be a place of love or be a place of listening, so that I'm not, as you said, creating a barrier. And like I said, sometimes it's easier than others.
Oh, this is so true. It can be challenging in any situation or any environment. But let's talk for a minute, because both you and I have a lot of experience in leadership, in spiritual communities, and
Mm-hmm.
in organizations that are spiritual in nature.
Yep.
And so a lot of times we talk about leadership, or we talk about, communication skills, and we talk about conflict resolution and all of those things that are skills we need to know as leaders. We also, I find, I won't say I find that in spiritual communities I've been a part of, that the majority of people are so shocked when there are disagreements, or when people say things, or they're not getting along, or there are these squabbles, or that there are cliques. Just like there are, all these things are in every place else they go. But
Mhm.
there's this myth that they brought into that, this is a spiritual community. Everybody's supposed to love everybody and like everybody, and everybody's equal, and all these stories that we make up, that we're not real people when we're in spiritual community.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so knowing that, I know that it's just a microcosm of the macrocosm.
Right.
At the same time, I really want to believe that if we can't be inclusive in spiritual communities, if we can't practice it when we have this common shared belief in spiritual values and principles, it can I even pretend to believe that we could do it out in the world, or in the workplace, or in our neighborhood, where there are people with all different kinds of religious beliefs as well as the other things. So I think that's another reason for me that that question is being inclusive of spiritual practice. It's like, yes, for me. And one of the places I want to practice it consciously and consistently is in spiritual community and in spiritually based organizations.
Mhm. Mhm. Right. I think part of the key to that is engagement, and having real engagement um, with each other, and having conversations, and being, even developing the small groups, or just one-on-one conversations like we're having now. I think when we have that engagement in spiritual community, because we are approaching things from, let's say, a similar point of view, that we have some common ground that we know is common ground, then we can have discussions when there are disagreements, or there are pieces that are like, I really haven't thought of it like that. I was having this conversation the other day with my ministerial intern, and we were talking about the phrase, if it's meant to be, it's up to me. And she hears that as, all right, I'm empowered. If it, I'm gonna go for it. I'm empowered, right? And for me, I hear that phrase and it's like, okay, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You're edging God out. You're pushing God away. You're pushing God aside. And she's like, but I don't see it that way. Here's how I see it. I see it as, it's like I'm empowered with spirit to do this. And I'm like, okay, that's really an interesting, different point of view. We're not making each other wrong, but having a conversation around it. Now, did she shift my opinion about that? Not really. Did I shift her opinion around that? Not really. But we have a greater understanding of how the other one sees it, how the other one hears it, how it's used, what kind of context is used, so that if I say it from the platform, like I did this past Sunday, in my context, it doesn't rub wrong. But now I also know, I'm not the only one who thinks like this. She thinks about this differently. So if she thinks about this differently, other people might hear this phrase differently too. And so then I become more aware that way. And when she says it from the platform, I now have a context of how she's using it, and I can support that too. And there might be people who don't necessarily resonate with it the way she talks about it. And yet, it's beautiful that we can all be in this conversation together, and she and I are willing to have this conversation.
I am reminded so often, it is fascinating to me that we are ever able to communicate anything at all.
Right?
because we say words assuming that people are interpreting those words the same way that we are saying them. I chose that phrase because of what it meant to me,
Mhm.
and my assumption that you will get that on your end, right? And it's just fascinating. Uh, yeah, that we are able to ever make sense to anyone,
Well,
including ourselves.
yeah. I mean, at almost every Sunday, people come up and, and they say, I love it when you talked about this or you said that. I'm like, did I talk about that? Did I say that? I don't think those words came out of my mouth, but sure. Okay. That's what you needed to hear. That's what you grabbed. All right. Perfect. We each received the message we received that day. So.
Exactly.
And the drawback to that is that sometimes that causes conflict.
Yes.
There was one time 4 or 5 years ago at this point, 4 years ago, where it was all innocent and playful. And, this one person did not take it that way. And they were deeply offended and mad and, took their toys and left. I mean, it was just like, whoa, where everybody else that I'm aware of received it playfully. That one person did not. They thought they were being talked to and attacked, and it was all on them. They got triggered. Again, back to the disowned qualities, the hidden beliefs that they had, right? The underlying commitments that they made to themselves to keep those things in place. And then that cascaded. I will say in community, because especially in spiritual community, we see this, I've been seeing it a lot lately, radically inclusive. And I kind of, I get the intention behind it. And as a spiritual leader in a community, I don't 100% agree with it. I can maybe go to the 95% of radically inclusive, because the way it gets interpreted is like, we love everybody. We welcome everybody. We should not turn anybody away. We should just accept everybody for who they are, as they are, da, 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 right? Yes. And when a person is toxic in the community and you've gone through the process of loving them, compassion, providing options, having conversations, and they are still toxic in the community and harming the community, that person, as radically as inclusive as I can be, as accepting as I can be, that person is no longer welcome in the community, because now they are harming the community. And as spiritual leaders in a community, our responsibility is for the health of the community. And sometimes one or two or a few, right, can create such a toxic environment that it is really harmful for the community. And do we provide them help? Sure.
Absolutely.
But, and I've had to do that. I've had to do it in our community twice.
Well, I do this work in business environments a lot as well. And it doesn't happen very much anymore, but for quite a number of years, one of the biggest pushbacks to inclusion strategy or any conversation about diversity being valued was that people really felt that meant everybody gets to set their own rules and you just have to accept it. It's like, no, that's not what it means at all. Mm-hmm. And I think you're right. I think sometimes in spiritual community that we try to use phrases like radically inclusive as a shortcut to explaining our desire or our vision. And you have to be careful about how people interpret it, and you have to be able to explain it. And yes, it doesn't mean that radically inclusive doesn't mean that every person can be a part of this community. It means that as a community, right, we are inclusive. We value that. That is kind of a line that we're not going to cross. But individually, there can be. I mean, I think you described. I don't think there are a ton of situations, but I think you described one.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here, let me tell you what I thought you were going to say.
Okay. Do tell.
You did not go there at all. So when you said, radically inclusive, we like to say it and blah, 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 I'm like, where my brain went was, well, really, that's impossible. If we say inclusion is an absolute quality of God, then you can't make it bigger because it's already the infinite. It's already the absolute. That would be like saying, like we can say radical forgiveness because forgiveness is a human quality or experience, right? Spirit has no need to forgive, right? So that radical forgiveness maybe, but it's like, oh, inclusion or being inclusive, if we say it is a spiritual quality, that then it is all in itself. You can't make it bigger, you can't make it smaller, you can't, we do it with love too, but if we're doing spiritual love, it is a wholeness in itself. It can't be bigger, it can't be smaller. I can't love you a little bit. From the human perspective, yes, but not from the spiritual perspective. God doesn't love me a little bit. God just loves me in a pure and whole way.
Right.
So I thought you were going to go there with radically inclusive. Like, you're either inclusive or you're not. There's like no bigger or smaller.
Well, but again, it gets back to what we were talking about, right? When we use the noun inclusion, right? Then yes, that's true. Just like love, the noun is, right? There can't be bigger or smaller if it's the spiritual quality. Wholeness, it either is or it isn't, right? So it is. But being more inclusive, which is how the human deals with it, or be more loving, again, is a human behavior, right? Then when we talk about being inclusive or being loving, now we're talking about behavior,
right?
Rather than the noun, right?
See,
God isn't peaceful, it's peace, right?
This is why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because I really am just, maybe I'll be writing about this since writing books seems to be my hobby. Maybe I'll be writing more about this, but right now I'm just exploring it because that statement I made a few weeks ago that inclusion is a spiritual practice, it just came out of my mouth as part of the conversation. It wasn't something that I had actually thought about, reflected on, journaled about. And I may have written that or journaled it at different points along the way, but not in a way that it was like that I was owning it.
Right.
I just am really clear. I do think of it as a spiritual practice. And yeah, this conversation is helping me land on more of why I believe that, and also where I think I want us to go next is if being inclusive is a spiritual practice, how do we demonstrate or model it? What are we doing or saying? So if I say visioning is a spiritual practice, then I know there are certain things that I do as a part of the visioning practice.
Right.
Inclusion or being inclusive is a spiritual practice.
Mhm.
What do I do?
So this kind of brings me back to, I mean, it all starts with us, right? It all starts here before we start moving outward, right? We start in the center and then move, radiate out like ripples in a pond. So if we're not already including every bit and piece of ourselves, if we're already disowning and we're othering parts of ourselves, that gets reflected in how we interact with others or interact with people, right? We don't like this quality within ourselves, so we don't like this type of person or that behavior or what have you. So we're already othering. So I think the first place is to start by owning those disowned qualities. And it can be things you don't like about yourself, or it could be your greatness as well, right? Like, Tracy, you are an awesome author, and if you were like, oh, no, 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 you're disowning your awesomeness, right? So it works both in what we perceive as positive and negative. So I see it as reclaiming that starting there with owning those bits and pieces of ourselves, owning those hidden beliefs, uncovering those hidden beliefs, and really finding out what we're most committed to that keeps those beliefs in place, that keeps these disowned qualities in place. Then we begin to shift. And the more we do this within, then we can also do this in relationship with one another. And then in community, because our communities have those disowned qualities,
So
right?
true.
Our communities have those disowned. Oh, we're not dogmatic. No. Right. Don't even go there. But
Yeah, right. I'm not going to get distracted by that.
So, but we have disowned qualities in spiritual community, right? We also have disowned qualities in our society, in our culture, in the culture of the United States, and all of the cultures that make up the culture of the United States, or then make up the culture of the Western Hemisphere, or what have you. There's all these different pieces that get into that cycle of socialization and how we are indoctrinated, enculturated, culturally conditioned, right? And all that gets layered in there. And so when we start peeling it, rather than peeling it like an onion, one of my friends uses the idea of a rose, that it's an ever blooming rose, so that you continue to peel away the outer layers to see the inner bud, and and so there's that fragrant sweet, rather than it having to be like oniony. And I don't like onions, so that's never worked for me. But then it continues to flower, right? It continues to blossom. We continue to see something new.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
love that. I
And
love
so that it's then peeling back those petals or those layers, starting from the micro, starting from the individual, and going to the mezzo, and then the macro. I think that's where we start.
Yeah, I like that. As you can see, it's like it's working. It's working. And maybe that's the question I want our audience to be thinking about too. If inclusion is your spiritual practice for the next week, how would you be showing up? What inner reflection would you participate in? And what behaviors would you consciously practice as you engage with others? Whether it's someone you know well, someone you live with, or the cashier at the grocery store, or the person in the car in the next lane when you're pumping gas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How would they know? Obviously, I'm not necessarily saying you have to speak to everybody. So I'm not, but I'm imagining if the person who's in the next lane pumping gas to me, next lane to me, and they're pumping gas, and our eyes meet, do I avert my, do I not look at them? Do I ignore them like I didn't see that we made brief eye contact? Or, I'm emptying my trash in the trash can and they're standing right there because they're on the other side of the pump. Do I say hello? Or am I so closed in that I I'm choosing not to engage with them out of fear, or because of what kind of car they're driving and I've made up a story about them, either that they're way more than me or way less than me. All of that are the barriers to creating a world where there is harmony. Because in those little micro experiences, I get revealed to me what's in my subconscious.
Yep.
That, I think, is part of why, for me, it's a spiritual practice, because I really do often, not 100%, but I often, like when I'm in the grocery store, this is 99% of the time. When I'm in the grocery store, I notice that, sure, I'm concentrating on, maybe what is on my list or what should be on my list if I had taken the time to write it before I left the house. And, but it's like my facial expression, or I'm not fully present. I'm thinking about the meeting I was in or the phone call I have to make. And I made a decision that when I'm in the grocery store, I will keep a smile on my face for no reason, right? That I would just have a pleasant expression, but for me, it's like smile. And so then if I do go into concentration, the smile might not be there, but I'll still have a pleasant countenance. And so what I realize is I don't speak to everybody in the grocery store, but often people will nod at me, or they will ask me a question, not because they think I work there, but because I feel approachable, right? And they don't expect that I'm going to snap at them or roll my eyes at them. And I'm not trying to pick up people in the grocery store. But what I realized is, after I had been doing this about 6 or 8 months, that it carried over when I was in other environments where I didn't really know people. And it did open me to certain conversations that I never would have had, that gave me a different perspective than I would have, because I don't know about that culture, or I don't know about, this place where I am. So for me, that's it's using it as a spiritual practice, using my spiritual practice to train my subconscious,
right,
to be open to people who are different from me. And I promise, when I started doing that, I had not thought it through to that level.
It's like, I'm just going to smile.
I'm going to be pleasant, and not to impress anybody else, but the way I want to be as I navigate the world.
Right.
I want to be at peace. I want to be at ease. I want to be not in fear, but in trust, and not like fear to faith, but a representation of God in human form, of spirit navigating the world. And spirit is just fully present as love and beauty and joy and peace and wholeness. And if I want to show up that way in the world, then how do I do that? So, I mean, that's kind of how it started. But what I realized is it also really had a carryover to my idea of inclusion.
Yeah. Well, because then we become more approachable, right? We're giving rather than always trying to get. I challenged my community a couple of weeks ago, actually, of like, give something to everybody you meet today. Everybody you come in contact with, give something to them. Now, it doesn't have to be a physical thing, but it could be eye contact. It could be a smile. It could be just being present, just witnessing, not even having eye contact, but give something to everybody you come in contact with.
I love that. I love that. And in effect, that is what being inclusive is about, receiving what everyone else has to give you and giving something to everyone, so that it all works together in the harmony that it was designed within or designed to be.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I love that we can just dive into this and then I can look at the clock and go, oh, it's time to be done.
Yeah. I noticed that too. I'm like, oh, but we can chat for more hours.
Oh, this show is over. The conversation may be never ending,
Mm-hmm.
but the show does have an ending time. So any closing comment that feels important to you or helpful to share about this question? Is inclusion, is being inclusive? No, that's a yes, no question. How is being inclusive a spiritual practice?
Oh, being inclusive as a spiritual practice, because it is consciously taking the moment, being present in the moment, and remembering that inclusion, just like love, just like peace, just like abundance, just like wholeness, just like joy, is your true nature. And there is nothing separating you from the totality of who you are.
Drop the mic. I have nothing to add to that. Just an expression of deep gratitude for your willingness to jump in and just explore this with me. I'm so grateful for you, Jeffrey Ryan.
And I am so grateful for you too, Tracy Brown.
So everybody, I hope that you got something from this conversation and that you too are now thinking about how is being inclusive a spiritual practice. And that's what we do right here on Poetry, Prayer, and Practice. We have the opportunity to explore some of the spiritual practices that we don't really think about all the time as spiritual practices. So I hope that you'll join me next Tuesday at 12 noon Mountain Time for the next episode of Poetry, Prayer, and Practice. And I hope that you will check out the archives at New Thought Media Network on YouTube or on Facebook for shows that you may have missed. My name is Tracy Brown, and I'll see you again real soon.
Thanks for watching. Join us again next week, or watch on demand at www.ntmedia.org or youtube.com/New Thought Media Network. New Thought Media Network, positively inspiring. Learn more at www.ntmedia.org.